My uncle that I've secretly loved for years invited me to his wedding. On my 22nd birthday, my uncle discovered my diary. After learning about my secret crush on him, he sent me abroad and spent millions on a lavish wedding to marry the love of his life. At the airport, he warned me coldly. Never have such inappropriate thoughts again. Years later, I returned, with a child in my arms. Orion's eyes widened in shock. Is this yours? I nodded with a calm smile. Yes. I just finished my postpartum recovery. Sitting on the plane, I still felt dazed. I never thought that after 5 years abroad, I would have the chance to return. After all, Orion had made it clear, in this lifetime I should never appear before him again. Yet, it was he who personally bought my ticket home, inviting me to attend his and Melissa's wedding anniversary celebration. After 2 layovers, I finally landed. Uma had been peacefully asleep on the plane, but as soon as we disembarked, she started crying. "Mommy, my feet hurt," she whimpered softly. Hearing her quiet sobs, I quickly picked her up and carried her toward the exit. At the arrival gate, I turned on my phone, ready to call a cab. Just then, my phone rang. Seeing the familiar number on the screen, I hesitated, unsure whether to answer. The call went unanswered. A second call followed almost immediately. I sighed and finally picked up. Orion's voice came through, steady, unchanged after all these years. "Are you out of the airport?" "I sent an assistant to pick you up," he said, his tone distant, as if we were mere acquaintances. I let out a bitter laugh. "I can get a cab myself." Silence followed. Orion probably hadn't expected that. Back then, he had taken care of everything for me. When I lived under his roof, all my needs were met. I never had to worry about something as simple as transportation. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice casual. "Let the assistant come anyway. I bought a gift for Melissa on your behalf, it's in the trunk. You can bring it with you to dinner." Orion was still the same, calculating, thoughtful in all the ways that mattered to him. Of course, when he had spent millions on their wedding venue and commissioned a custom diamond ring for Melissa, it had been clear just how much he loved her. "All right," I murmured, rubbing my forehead. He didn't respond right away, but he didn't hang up either. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "Yara, after 5 years abroad, I hope you've truly reflected on things. If you do anything to Melissa, I won't let you off easy." His words stunned me. The noise of the airport faded into the background. Orion thought I had come back to stir trouble. Before I could reply, the line went dead. But he could rest assured, I had no intention of interfering in their lives. I only wanted to take care of Uma and find a job. As I stepped out of the airport, I lowered my head. The proud 22-year-old me could never have imagined this version of myself, returning home like this, carrying the weight of everything that had happened. I had been sent abroad by Orion on my 22nd birthday. That day, he had found my diary. My parents had died in a cruise ship accident when I was young, leaving Orion to take care of me. Our relationship had always been harmonious, until I grew older and realized my feelings for him weren't just those of a niece for her uncle. I liked him. But I knew, even then, that there was no future for us. So I had poured all my emotions into my diary, keeping them hidden. If Orion had never discovered it, I could have continued pretending, convincing myself that my feelings were nothing more than admiration. But he had found it. He had torn the pages apart, his expression one of disgust. "Don't you know I'm your uncle? Even if we aren't related by blood, we will always be family." And just like that, my world had shattered. The usually gentlemanly and refined Orion was no longer gentle. He shouted at me, his eyes filled with disgust. At the time, I wanted to explain, but there was nothing I could say. In the end, all I could do was bow repeatedly, apologizing over and over. I told him I was wrong. That I shouldn't have fallen for him. But Orion didn't calm down. The next day, he resigned from the job I had lined up for after graduation and, under the guise of sending me to study abroad, arranged for me to attend a remote university overseas. To ensure I had no contact with the outside world, he even hired bodyguards to watch over me. At first, I couldn't understand why he was treating me this way. Then, 1 month after I left, news of Orion's marriage spread everywhere. Only then did I realize, he had always had someone in his heart. I watched the wedding video over and over again. In the footage, Orion looked at Melissa with gentle, unwavering love. He had never looked at me that way. That was the moment I understood, keeping me by his side all those years had been nothing more than an act of responsibility and pity. "Miss John, please get in the car." The assistant's voice pulled me back to reality. I nodded and stepped into the car, carefully holding the sleeping Uma in my arms. As he glanced at Uma, a flicker of surprise crossed the assistant's face. "Miss John, this is..." I raised a finger to my lips, signaling him to keep his voice down. I didn't want Uma to wake up. Once we were seated in the back, I responded softly, "This is my daughter." The assistant nodded in understanding and didn't ask any further questions. When we arrived at our destination, I was momentarily stunned. It was the same hotel where Orion and Melissa had gotten married. Every year since their wedding, Orion had hosted an anniversary celebration here. He always personally selected gifts for Melissa, sparing no expense. I thought to myself, he really cherished her. In the past, he had kept me far away from their world. This year, inviting me back was probably just another way to remind me how happy they were. I stepped out of the car just as Melissa approached with a bright smile. Unlike my simple clothes and weary appearance, Melissa was radiant, elegantly dressed, effortlessly beautiful. She had been well taken care of by Orion. Then, suddenly, her smile froze. I knew she had seen Uma. Sure enough, when she stopped in front of me, her expression was filled with surprise. "Yara, you had a child abroad without telling me? I've been married to your uncle for so long, and you still treat me like an outsider." Before I could respond, Melissa reached out and took Uma from my arms without asking. Uma, startled, woke up and immediately began crying, struggling against her hold. I quickly took Uma back and gently patted her back, soothing her tears. Melissa had always known about my past feelings for Orion. I had no intention of getting entangled with her now. But Melissa, stubborn as ever, still wanted to hold Uma again. By the time we arrived in the hotel's private dining room, Uma was still clinging to me, refusing to let go. Melissa forced a smile as she handed her back. "Your uncle knows how difficult it is to raise a child. We haven't thought about having kids these past few years. Seeing that you have a daughter, I guess I got too excited." Several people were already seated inside. Uncomfortable with socializing, I chose a corner seat. Melissa, however, sat right next to me. She linked arms with mine, enthusiastically introducing me and Uma to the guests. Their expressions were filled with subtle amusement and curiosity. I felt their gazes linger on me for too long, probing, judging. The atmosphere was suffocating. Needing a moment alone, I excused myself to the restroom. When I returned, I overheard voices coming from inside the room. Someone asked Melissa why she had brought an unlucky thing like me. Melissa chuckled lightly. "What do you mean, unlucky? Yara is Orion's sister. She just went down the wrong path before, trying to seduce Orion. But now that she has a child, I'm sure she won't make the same mistakes again." I froze outside the doorway. So this was what they thought of me. A delusional woman who had once tried to seduce her own uncle. A shameless, disgraceful person. I felt Uma tugging at my clothes, sensing my unease. I composed myself, gently patting her head before stepping back inside. Some things had to be faced eventually. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but suddenly, the entire room stood up. "Mr. John is here." "Hello, Mr. John." A crowd gathered near the entrance, eager to greet him. I remained in my seat. After a long moment, I finally lifted my head. Orion stood at the doorway. He looked slightly thinner than before. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded the same cold, commanding presence. Melissa leaned into him, their eyes meeting with effortless warmth and familiarity. He didn't notice me in the corner. Years had passed, but some things never changed, he was still the center of attention. The only person who no longer belonged in this world was me. Suddenly, Melissa turned toward him with a smile and nudged him playfully. Orion, Yara is here too. You two haven't seen each other in years, you should catch up. She even brought a surprise. At the mention of a surprise, Orion didn't react. Instead, he helped Melissa to her seat and ordered a glass of milk for her before finally looking in my direction. Uma, sensing something, shrank against me, her small hands gripping my sleeve tightly. Orion's gaze finally landed on her. His expression shifted instantly. His eyes widened in shock. Yara, what is this? Orion was asking about Uma. The expressions on the guests' faces were all the same, either surprised or watching the scene unfold like entertainment. Melissa spoke before I could. Orion, this is Yara's daughter. Isn't she cute? She looks just like Yara. She must be a few years old by now. Orion's gaze shifted from Uma to me, scrutinizing me with an intensity that made my heart tighten. Just when I thought he would ignore me altogether, he spoke, his voice hoarse. He pointed at Uma. During these years abroad, you got married and had a child? I lifted my head and met his gaze directly. Then, I nodded. I got married a while ago. Sorry, I didn't tell you. Silence filled the room. Orion's stare deepened as if he were trying to determine whether I was telling the truth. Melissa opened her mouth as if to say something, but before she could, Orion stepped closer to me. Where's your husband? I pressed my lips together for a brief moment before replying, he's busy lately, so he couldn't come. A murmur of whispers and quiet snickers spread through the room, though the guests tried to suppress their amusement out of respect for Orion. His face remained unreadable, but I could sense the tension beneath his silence. In the end, he didn't say anything and simply sat back down next to Melissa. I ate the meal without tasting a single bite. While the others chatted about how perfect Orion and Melissa were together, all I wanted was to take Uma back to rest. The rent here wasn't too expensive. I could still afford it. I had no plans of going abroad again. The meal ended quickly. As I got up to leave, Orion stopped me. I have something to talk to you about. Melissa remained by his side, watching me with a knowing smile. In the private room, Orion's expression was cold, his voice just as emotionless. Yara, since we all have our own families now, I hope you won't come looking for me again. Melissa let out a soft laugh and gently chided him. Orion, don't say that to Yara. She's a grown woman now. She knows what she should and shouldn't do. The two of them spoke in perfect harmony, an unbreakable pair. And I was the outsider. No matter how many promises I made, they never believed me. But I still nodded and bowed slightly. I won't in the future. They didn't respond. I had nothing else to say, so I turned and left, holding Uma in my arms. Orion called his assistant to see me off, but this time I refused. Back at the small rental apartment, Uma tugged on my sleeve and looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. Mom, do Uncle and Aunt dislike me? They say children are perceptive. They see and feel everything. I shook my head gently. No, they don't dislike Uma. They just dislike me. Uma hesitated as if she had more to ask, but in the end, she simply hugged me tightly and whispered, Mom, you've worked hard. At that moment, the tears I had been holding back all day threatened to fall. But I couldn't cry in front of Uma. So I tilted my head back and swallowed my emotions. After putting Uma to sleep, my phone suddenly buzzed with a message. The sender was Melissa. Yara, if you have time, let's talk. I frowned and replied, you can just text me. But she didn't send anything else. Just before bed, my phone rang again. It was Melissa. I'm downstairs at your place. I just want to ask you one thing. I hesitated before answering. What is it? Melissa's tone was light, almost casual. Do you have any thoughts of going abroad again? Orion and I actually both think it would be best if you stayed overseas. Your husband is abroad too, right? Wouldn't it be better for you to be with him? At first, I was confused. Then, realization set in, and I almost laughed. So this was what had driven her to contact me in the middle of the night. They hated me this much. They couldn't even tolerate me living in the same country as them. I glanced at Uma, sleeping peacefully beside me. Without another word, I got up and went downstairs. There, under the dim glow of the streetlight, stood Melissa. I took a slow breath, then looked her directly in the eyes. I don't plan to go abroad. Even if only for Uma's sake, I would never take her on such an exhausting journey again. Melissa let out a soft laugh. I stood in front of Melissa, taking a deep breath before locking eyes with her. I don't plan to go abroad. Even if just for Uma's sake, I wouldn't put her through such an exhausting journey again. Melissa let out a light laugh. With no one else around, the mask of politeness slipped from her face, revealing pure contempt. Yara, I know you're struggling financially. What if I offered you a sum of money? Would you be willing to leave? I fell silent. It was no secret that I was short on money. Melissa and Orion knew how difficult things had been for me abroad. And now, when trying to pressure me, they knew exactly where my weakness lay. But still, I refused. Melissa looked genuinely surprised. That night, we parted on bad terms. For the next few days, I spent all my time searching for work. But no matter where I applied, I was always rejected after the first round of interviews. It wasn't until a young interviewer hesitantly pulled me aside that I finally understood why. I'm really sorry, Miss Ching told us not to hire you. Melissa wasn't just trying to push me out of the country, she was making sure I had no way to survive here. I stood frozen for a long moment before finally thanking the interviewer for telling me the truth. As I left the office building, my phone buzzed with a notification from the hospital. The night before, I had made an appointment to get antidepressants. During my consultation, the doctor looked at me with concern. Your condition has worsened significantly. I strongly recommend you schedule more counseling sessions. Back when I was abroad, doctors had told me the same thing. It seemed my depression had only gotten worse. Leaving the clinic, I was reading the prescription instructions when I accidentally bumped into someone while turning a corner. That night, I jolted awake, my nose filled with the acrid scent of smoke. The burning smell grew stronger. Something was wrong. I threw off my blanket and stumbled toward the window. Thick plumes of smoke billowed into the sky. The building was on fire. My mind went blank for a split second, then panic took over. I grabbed Uma from her bed. Half asleep, she rubbed her eyes. Mom, what's wrong? When she realized what was happening, her small hands clutched my sleeve tightly. Mom, she whispered, her voice trembling. Fear made my hands shake as I held her. Fumbling with the door, I finally managed to get it open and rushed toward the fire escape, clutching Uma tightly against me. I stumbled down the metal stairs, falling 3 or 4 times. My knees were scraped raw, but I barely registered the pain. Nothing mattered except getting Uma out. When we finally reached the street, the building behind us was engulfed in flames. A crowd had already gathered outside. Firefighters were working to control the blaze. I clung to Uma, my body leaning against a tree for support. My vision blurred. The heat, the smoke, the flashing lights, it all felt too familiar. Then I heard Uma's small, frightened voice. Mom, are we going to die? Her words snapped me back to reality. I tightened my grip on her. No, we won't. As long as Uma was by my side, I would never let anything happen to her. Because Uma's birth mother had already died saving me. In my second year abroad, Orion had finally loosened his control over me a little. That was when I met Sara. She was a university psychology counselor, the one person I turned to when I felt like I had nowhere else to go. I told her everything. My feelings for Orion. My past. My shame. I expected her to judge me, just like everyone else had. But she didn't. Instead, she encouraged me to move forward, to let go of what was holding me back. She even conducted therapy experiments with me. One of them involved showing me photos of Uma as a newborn. Sara had just gone through a divorce at the time. But one thing was certain, she loved Uma. And during those days, when I sat across from her in that quiet counseling room, it was the closest I had ever been to recovery. One night, a fire broke out in the lab building. I was wearing earplugs and didn't hear the alarm. My mentor, Sara, rushed upstairs to get me. By then, the heat had already weakened the ceiling fixtures. Just as we were about to leave, a light fixture came crashing down. She shielded me with her body. The impact struck her head directly. Before the firefighters arrived, she must have known she wouldn't survive. She clutched my hand, her voice trembling as she made one final request. "Yara, please, take care of Uma. Raise her as your own." I agreed. And then, Sara died in the fire. That night, I went to pick up Uma. She was too young to remember much about her mother. From then on, she called me Mom. And my depression spiraled deeper. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames. The lab. The moment Sara fell. That fire became my trauma. The only person who had ever been truly kind to me abroad was gone. For years after, I lived like a walking corpse. Now, standing outside my burning apartment building, I realized my back was drenched in sweat. A car pulled up in front of me. The door swung open, and Orion stepped out. Without hesitation, he strode toward me, his expression unreadable. "I heard there was a fire here. Come on, I'll take you to the hospital." He reached for my wrist, his grip firm. I jerked my hand away. "Mr. John, I'm fine. Don't trouble yourself." His reaction was instant, sharp, almost desperate. "Yara. What do you take me for?" "I looked into your medical records abroad. Last December alone, you visited the hospital 3 times, all for psychiatric treatment. You have depression, don't you? Why didn't you tell me?" I stared at him, my lips curling into a bitter smile. Of all people, Orion had no right to be questioning me. And yet, he didn't stop. "You never even registered for marriage. Yara, what did you even learn in those years abroad? How did you become so depraved?" Behind me, Uma flinched, her small body trembling. Tears streamed down her face. I inhaled deeply. Then, without hesitation, I raised my hand and slapped Orion across the face. The sharp sound echoed in the night. Orion's words faltered, stuck like a broken record. He touched his cheek, staring at me in stunned silence. "Orion," I said, my voice steady, "what do you expect me to say? That I was depressed and wished I were dead? That I almost got caught in a shooting abroad? That I lived in fear every single day? Tell me, would you have cared?" He said nothing. I let out a hollow laugh. "And one more thing. You were the one who cut me off first." His expression darkened. He took a step toward me, his lips parting as if to speak. I shook my head and stepped back, exhausted. "Let's leave it at that, Orion." This was how things had turned out. 5 years was long enough to see someone clearly. I picked up Uma and walked away, leaving Orion behind. From now on, my only wish was to never cross paths with him again. Since the fire department needed time to investigate the cause of the fire, Uma and I were temporarily relocated to a nearby hotel. Uma remained quiet and well-behaved, adjusting to the unfamiliar environment without complaint. But the investigation results were chilling. The fire wasn't an accident, it was arson. And the mastermind behind it was Melissa. Maybe from the moment I refused to leave the country, she had already planned to kill me. Melissa was arrested and taken to the police station. I hated her. But in the end, Uma and I were still alive, that was enough. I thought Orion would stand by her, but the very next day, he announced their divorce. Along with the divorce, Orion also exposed the truth about his marriage to Melissa. It turned out their relationship had always been a sham. Their marriage was, first, a business alliance. Second, a PR move, an illusion of a perfect couple, meant to boost stock prices. Facing the media, Orion bowed his head and spoke solemnly. "I apologize for deceiving everyone all these years. But one thing is certain, Melissa was never my true love." Reading the headlines, I only felt irony. Just days ago, they had celebrated their wedding anniversary. Now, their marriage was over. In the police station, Melissa confessed everything. She admitted to attempting to murder me, she just hadn't succeeded. But she showed no remorse. When I visited her, she looked exhausted, but the hatred in her eyes remained. "Yara, I only regret one thing, not hiring someone to stab you to death instead," she spat viciously. "So what if I forced Orion to marry me? We were husband and wife for 5 years. This is all your fault. If you had just stayed away, I wouldn't have needed to kill you." Looking at her, hysterical, broken, I didn't feel anger anymore. Only pity. Before leaving, I spoke my first and only words to her. "Melissa, after all your scheming, did you ever get what you wanted?" She fell silent. As I walked away, I could hear her muffled sobs behind me. Fate had played a cruel joke on all of us. If I could turn back time, I would have never fallen for Orion. The fire incident caused a public uproar. People dug into Melissa and Orion's past, uncovering the truth. Melissa had pursued Orion relentlessly. Their marriage had been nothing more than a contract. Orion emphasized to the media that they had no real emotional connection. But I knew better. No matter how much he denied it, his eyes had told the truth. There had been something between them. Had Melissa not gone this far, Orion would probably still be by her side. For Uma's safety, I decided to move away. It was time for a fresh start. With Uma now old enough, I enrolled her in kindergarten. On her first day, she was beaming with excitement. When I arrived to pick her up, she ran into my arms, her voice bright with joy. "Mom, I made so many friends." For the first time in a long while, I smiled genuinely. This was what truly mattered. Uma's happiness. Our future. Melissa was taken to the police station. I hated her, but the fact that Uma and I were still alive was already the best outcome. I thought Orion would stand by Melissa, but the next day, he announced their divorce. Along with it, he revealed their secrets to the public. It turned out their marriage had always been a sham. A business alliance first, a PR stunt second, to boost stock prices. Facing the media, Orion bowed his head. "I apologize for deceiving everyone all these years. But one thing is certain, Melissa was never my true love." Reading this, I felt nothing but irony. Just days ago, they had celebrated their wedding anniversary. Now, their marriage was over. At the police station, Melissa confessed everything. She admitted to attempting to kill me, she just hadn't succeeded. But she showed no remorse. I met with her once. She looked worn out, but her hatred toward me hadn't faded. "Yara, my only regret is not having someone stab you to death instead," she spat. "So what if I forced Orion to marry me? We were husband and wife for 5 years. This is all your fault. If you had just stayed away, I wouldn't have needed to kill you." I watched her, broken and hysterical. I didn't feel anger anymore. Just pity. Before leaving, I spoke only once. "Melissa, after everything, did you ever get what you wanted?" She fell silent. As I walked away, I heard her sobbing. Fate had played a cruel joke on all of us. If I could turn back time, I would have never fallen for Orion. The fire incident caused a public uproar. People dug into Melissa and Orion's past, uncovering the truth. Melissa had pursued Orion relentlessly. Their marriage had been nothing more than a contract. Orion publicly emphasized they had no real emotional connection. But I knew better. No matter how much he denied it, his eyes had told the truth. There had been something between them. Had Melissa not gone this far, Orion would probably still be by her side. For Uma's safety, I decided to move away. It was time for a fresh start. With Uma now old enough, I enrolled her in kindergarten. On her first day, she was beaming with excitement. At pickup time, I arrived early, waiting at the gate. Uma ran into my arms, her voice bright with pride. "Mom. A lot of kids cried today, but I didn't." I smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's because Uma is a strong girl." She kept talking, but then suddenly stopped. She looked to the side, hesitant and timid. I followed her gaze, only to see Orion. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, his lips pursed as he stared at Uma and me. Uma shrank back, still remembering how he had yelled at me last time. In the end, Orion stepped forward. "Yara, I know everything now." Hearing this, warning bells rang in my head. I turned to leave, but Orion blocked my way. "This child, she's your mentor's, isn't she? Let me help you raise her. I've always kept your room. Yara, as long as you turn back, we'll always have a chance." I held Uma close. How nice his words sounded. As long as I turn back, we'll always have a chance. Why doesn't he say we don't have a chance anymore? Because Orion doesn't love me. He just doesn't want to lose me, whether as a niece or as a lover. But I don't want to be either. I shook my head. "Orion, there's no need for these words. It's all in the past. The good and the bad. Everything has passed." I met his stunned gaze and slowly spoke. "You were right before. My feelings for you were more dependence than love. Thank you for helping me realize that. I don't need Orion anymore." This was the last time I saw him. I didn't look back. I just walked forward. That night, as we sat down for dinner, Uma hesitated before whispering to me. "Mom." I sneaked a look at him after we left. "And?" I asked. He was crying. I nodded, reaching for the stove. "So, what do you want to eat tonight?" Children are easy to distract. Hearing me mention food, Uma instantly brightened, excitedly listing her favorites. As I entered the kitchen, my phone buzzed. I checked the screen, an email. A job offer. The interview I had attended a few days ago, I had passed. At last, this day had come. After everything, I realized something. A peaceful, ordinary life. That's what true happiness is. I stopped hearing much about Orion and Melissa after that. I only knew Melissa had been sentenced to death. Her family had disowned her. And Orion. He had thrown himself into work, so much that he ended up hospitalized for a stomach ulcer. One day, while he was still in the hospital, he reached out to me. He didn't ask to see me. Instead, he asked me for one last thing. "Yara. I want you to do an inheritance notarization with me. If anything happens to me, I want to leave everything to you." Late one night, Orion called me. "Yara, I really regret not accepting your confession back then. Instead, I chose Melissa for business interests." His voice was hoarse, filled with exhaustion. I laughed lightly. "But I never confessed to you, nor did I plan to." He had seen my diary, yes. But in my heart, there was never a plan to confess. I had only wanted to secretly like him for a little while. That was enough. But I had paid the price for my youthful crush. Orion fell silent. Before he could hang up, I did, then blocked his number. I think this was our final goodbye. The feelings between us had been washed away by time. There was nothing left. The next time we meet, it might be at Orion's funeral. My future is still brand new.
Some people, you only realize their importance after losing them. When I first learned about Yara's secret crush, my reaction was panic. I ignored the secret joy in my heart and instinctively scolded her. That same time, Melissa came to me with a proposal, a marriage alliance. She had done favors for my family. After one night of consideration, I made my decision. Following Melissa's wishes, I sent Yara abroad, leaving a 5-year gap in her life. At that time, I never imagined how the wheels of fate would turn. Melissa and I had agreed to be married for only 6 years. But as the time neared, she wanted to extend our contract. Then, Yara returned. Melissa became restless. She wanted to harm Yara. I dared not imagine what I would do if Melissa had succeeded. That day, I understood one thing. I could never lose Yara. I divorced Melissa. But I didn't know anything about Yara's child. Still, I knew one thing, I liked Yara. If she gave me the chance to be the third wheel in her life, I would take it. After some investigation, I discovered the truth. The child was her deceased mentor's daughter. My first reaction was, wild joy. Yara had never dated. Never married. She was raising a child alone. Did this mean I still had a chance? I found Yara. But everything was different from what I had imagined. She rejected me. I drank myself into sickness. I was hospitalized for a stomach ulcer. And then, I overheard the nurses talking about Yara. Only then did I learn. Yara had kidney problems. She might need an organ transplant. At that moment, I made a decision. A crazy one. I had been busy with work all these years. Death was probably coming for me sooner or later. But before I died, I wanted to leave something for Yara. She didn't want my inheritance. So, I'll give her something else. Yara can hate me. She can refuse to attend my funeral. But I hope she remembers me. Please. This is my last wish. After signing the voluntary organ donation agreement, I felt relieved. Yara. I hope you can remember me in another way. Even if one day I die. At least I will have left you something useful. Of course, I never told her. It's really a pity.